Hello, welcome everybody. This is Hixson Economics or Hixson Phi Beta, and today our guest is University of Chicago professor Stephen Durlauf. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Stephen, welcome to the podcast and to Uzbekistan. And I want to introduce you briefly to our audience. Stephen is a professor of economics at Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. His research spans many fields, including microeconomics, macroeconomics. He's and econometrics. He's very well known across many fields that may seem not very well, I would say, interconnected, but I'm going to ask you more on this. And he's very well known methodologically for introducing sort of sociological thinking in econometrics. He has done work on inequality, poverty, economic growth, and economic methods. He has been running a working group called Human Capital and Economic Opportunity from 2013 till 2022, from now on. He has been an editor of Journal of Economic Literature. He has edited many handbooks on different economic topics, and his, I would say, publication record is really quite impressive. And even going through the list and abstracts was quite a bit of a challenge. So without further ado, Stephen, so my first question is this. You have done quite a bit of work in economic growth, both as a research, but also as a person who edited the volumes on this. And a lot of people here in Uzbekistan are interested in what is economic growth and how a country or a society can reach an economic growth. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, the interest in economic growth is derivative from the desire that the population have higher living standards. That can represent, you can measure that by the incomes per person, or you can measure it by measured life expectancy, health, education, and other things that make life good. So that's, in some level, that is as fundamental a question to ask about a society as any. So the study of economic growth is asking the question, if you look across I'll say the 2,000 years of modern history, how do we understand the patterns of economic development, both the incomprehensibly large increases in prosperity that exist today compared to 200 years ago, as well as the differences across societies. So one question would be, why is it that there's a set of countries, the United States, Japan, Western Europe, I could put it into Canada, that have extremely high levels of economic success, whereas other countries, of course, are doing less well. So understanding the heterogeneity is one fundamental question. A second question, which is related to that, is what can policy do about it? Now, some of the things that have to do with economic growth are going to be factors that are beyond the control, or maybe even the influence of a policymaker. But of course, many policies have consequences for economic growth, and so the specific question perhaps to ask broadly for Uzbekistan is what set of government policies will be most conducive to economic growth. Now, I should say that in thinking about growth, there's really, again, two dimensions of it. One of them is overall how big the pie is, but the second has to do with the distribution of the pie. And broadly speaking, a message that comes out of the work of Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson on understanding a famous book called Why Nations Fail, and its sequel called The Narrow Corridor, is that a key feature to understanding sustained prosperity and development in society is what they call inclusive growth. And what that means is that a society is structured, an economy is structured, government policy is structured in such a way that the successes of the economy overall, the growing of the pie, also represent improvements for much of the population. And so that's really the background to this literature.
So when thinking about the growth, like one thing that can kind of jumps out to any student studying this was that for like as you said, like in the most of the growth that, as we know, happened in last, let's say, 300 years or 400.
Mm-hmm.
But before that, the heterogeneity across societies, but also like across time, was minuscule. Like it's like a graph of like almost a a straight line, and then something happens 300 or 400 years ago, and it kind of jumps up. And there are many theories on that. I would say libraries of books written about what has happened. There's a recent book by Aginion on that, I would say, and James Robinson Darren Afchamoglu's book also kind of tries to explain this. There's Germs and Steel.
Germs and Steel.
Germs and Steel. And then, there's so many books and research on that. But how do you model it for yourself? Like, how do you explain it to yourself why the world has grown so fast, or some parts of the world?
So let me divide that into two pieces. If you ask me what is the seminal set of events that caused the transition to sustained growth, I think they, for historically contingent reasons, they happen to occur in Europe. And so what you have is essentially the combination of the Enlightenment, which was a change in the way that people thought about the relationship to nature, the relationship to each other, et cetera, which leads and is associated with the scientific revolution. Once you have those two events, then you have the next step, which is the Industrial Revolution. So in some ways, the story of the extraordinary transformation to modern contemporary levels of prosperity, I think, is derivative from the Enlightenment / the scientific revolution. A second question you would ask is, why did it happen in Europe? And that's actually in the literature related to a question called the Great Divergence. And what that means is in 1600, if you look at India, China, and Europe, the levels of prosperity were not appreciably different. But something happened in Europe. It took off, and India and China not only did not take off, they stagnated and declined. Of course, once you go farther back in history, you see that there's periods of stagnation and decline across different regions. Europe was not, Europe had, substantial periods where it was far less economically developed than other parts of the world. And so, with reference to kind of the modern era, I think of it partially as the question is, what was it about the configuration of political institutions, social institutions, the nature of ideas and ideologies in Europe that allowed that transition to modern science, modern, sort of enlightened, quote unquote, ways of thinking? That seems to me the hinge point in history with respect to what happened with respect to Europe. Now, once you go down that route, of course, shall we say Europeans were aggressive people. And so a consequence of the takeoff is that you have Europe expanding across the globe, and that had adverse consequences for other parts of the world. So the fact that they were the first mover, or they went first, also could be associated with stagnation elsewhere. So so that's part of the story that one does not want to ignore. But I think that that's kind of the hinge event was is the Enlightenment, and in my judgment, the scientific revolution, because I think it's from that the Industrial Revolution ultimately derives. Now, in saying all that, there were institutions in Europe that were conducive to these profound changes in understanding the nature of the world that translated into economic development. So let me expand on that a little bit, and with an anecdote. Okay. Mikhail Gorbachev, when I was an assistant professor, visited Stanford. I think it was whether it was 1989, 1990, I don't remember. And one of the things Stanford did was that it invited some of the leading scientists, thinkers there to speak to him. What was your message for the Soviet Union and how to develop? And of course, I wasn't invited. I wasn't even invited to be in the room. I was just an assistant professor. But I talked to people who were in the room, and there was a physicist who said something to Gorbachev that was very profound. What he said to Gorbachev was, the Soviet Union scientists are just as good as the Americans. Your physicists are just as good as ours. Your mathematicians are just as good as ours. So why are we so much richer? He said it was because at Stanford isn't just Stanford scientists, it's the Silicon Valley. And that was that scientific advances in the United States, and of course it's applied to Europe as well, they became part of the economy. They commercialized. In contrast, in the Soviet case, all of these scientific advances did not translate into the economy. They stagnated in that sense. And in fact, Lauren Graham, who's the leading Western historian of Soviet science, at the end of the Soviet era, published a book called Lonely Ideas, in which you could identify Soviet predecessors to things such as computers and semiconductors. They just didn't go anywhere. And so I'm telling you the story this way, which is there's this broad question about, the way the engagement, the knowledge changes, the way which is derivative from thinking about the relationship between individuals, nature, et cetera. And that's what I call the scientific and industrial and Enlightenment eras. But you have to append to that a vision of an institutional and social structure, economic structure, that these advances lead to enhanced prosperity. And obviously people who are listening to this will at least have parents that lived during the Soviet era. And I think the reason I wanted to, digress with this anecdote is I think there was something very deep in what the physicist said, which is that scientific knowledge by itself did not lead to prosperity. It was scientific knowledge that converted, it's really science that becomes technology and is commercialized that leads to these advances.
I see. Yeah, that's a very profound point, because in history books, when you study like history of science, there are a lot of places in which very many fundamental advances have happened. I mean, including Uzbekistan for some reason, for some period of time, and then in India, for example, or in China, there were people working on science, but they never actually. I mean, I'm not talking about like Middle Ages. But,
yes. And that's why I emphasize the sense of historical contingency. There was a configuration of ideas, of institutions that at this point in time came together with sort of a perfect storm, and that irreversibly changed history.
I see. So more on economic growth and one particular, I would say, parameter in the model. Many economists say, and I would say this is almost a consensus view, that in the long run, what matters for growth and prosperity is increasing productivity.
Yes.
Right? And so in Introduction to Macroeconomics, and I'm sure in New Uzbekistan University as well, they would teach something like there will be a factor called A or some alpha or whatever. And that they would say we call an increase in productivity. And that would determine the long run. Do they use the word steady state in introduction? But let's say the long run level of prosperity.
Prosperity, that's sufficient, I think, yes.
So, but then the student would ask, like, how you increase that part, if that's the most important part. The other things with what we call endogenous, and then how do you make changes to that parameter? Or let me be more sort of not cynical, but like critical of that idea, is that in some circles they say economists use productivity growth because they cannot explain why societies prosper, and the unexplained variation they kind of concentrate it into this parameter. Like how should one think about this?
Yeah. I think the concern is a legitimate one. So let me step back and say that, and I don't want to profess any deep knowledge of Uzbekistan, the state of the economy, but one wants to distinguish between economic growth in societies that are in transition and are developing versus economies that are already developed. And so even though Uzbekistan is a much older society and civilization than the United States, it's a much younger economy. And so if you ask the question about, the economic growth in the United States, it's going to be dominated by changes in the productivity of the economy. And examples of that would be the information, all the information technologies, which obviously profoundly transform things. For Uzbekistan, the challenges are going to focus on this transition to the state of being, more developed. And so, and of course, China is a different example of that in terms of a case where you saw unbelievably high growth. And so what are the kind of lessons to think about? One of them, of course, is that Uzbekistan had to create an economy in 1991. I mean, the end of the central planning, the end of the Soviet era, meant the reconstitution of economic relations. I don't want to say from nothing, but from profound transformations. And so, the development of functioning markets is fundamental to economic growth. I think that the Chinese example is obviously illustrative of that. Now, what I mean by functioning markets are in which contracts are enforced, in which they, corrupt, the usual things, malfeasance are addressed and the like. But these clearly are of fundamental importance, and the Chinese example speaks for itself. A second issue is going to be the levels of capital in the society, and capital comes in the type that's embedded in machines, in structures. But the one that I think deserves pride of place is what's called human capital. In other words, the education levels of the population. And so if, my easy, cheap advice would be that that's the place that what the government should give the strongest attention, which is the more educated a population, the more the capacity of individuals to function in an economy. And by implication, the more the economy is going to develop. Now, this question about productivity it's a mysterious one. And so one proposition would be that, one is asking about, progress in science. One thing that I think, and this is why Paul Romer received a Nobel Prize, was emphasizing that the process of the generation of ideas is, to use some jargon, autocatalytic, which is a fancy way of saying ideas beget ideas. So think about these moments in history. So I'm going to give you Western ones because that's what I know. Something happened in Germany somewhere between 1880 and 1920. All of modern physics emerges. And so there clearly was this explosion of ideas. Ideas beget ideas, and suddenly this takeoff. You can think of other examples in history where this happens.
Massive AI or something like that.
Yes, and so this is another example where it may happen. And so I think one of the reasons why you have explosions of ideas is because there's something intrinsic to the nature of ideas, where ideas beget growing ideas. They feed upon themselves and expand. A second thing is to observe that resources matter. In other words, the investments of societies in their scientific establishments are going to matter for the development of new ideas, the development of new science. And so, to give an example, particle physics is reliant on extremely expensive machinery so that you can discover new particles, verify theories, so on and so forth. Think of the pharmaceutical industries or the development of medical technologies. These actually do require investments, and governments, I think it is fair to say, have a very important role to play in their cultivation. The third thing I would say is that the nature of science, it requires an intellectual freedom. In other words, that people have to be willing to think about anything, and they have to not be unduly penalized if they're wrong. In other words, it has to be a process of unhampered intellectual interaction, antagonism sometimes, but debate and contemplation. And again, I put this on the table because an issue that in the Soviet Union was there were dimensions of Soviet science which are complete failures. Biology, genetics. Yeah. Yes, and so those are like man-made failure. Yes, and so I'm bringing it up because it's the textbook example of a regime that destroyed science because it did not allow intellectual openness.
Oh, that's it. So you've used the term human capital.
Yes.
But I just want to say to our listeners, yes, Stephen is known to be a critic of another related term called social capital.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the definitions, I would say, and like interactions with it? Because sometimes I hear people use, people not only like sort of on the street, but also in their writing, when they say, I heard this example, it's like saying like, human capital includes even social capital or vice versa. So.
Yeah. So the sense in which I've been a critic of the term social capital is I think that it's vague. So let me start by saying what I think is important in it. Economists like to use this word capital, and capital just means stuff that's productive. And so a machine is capital; it's productive. A building is something that's productive. Gary Becker and Theodore Schultz, I think, were probably associated with the term human capital, and their idea was that much of the productive capacity of a society is not embedded in machines, is embedded in people. And so a human capital of an individual would reflect their education. It would reflect their talents, their abilities. And so you can think of that as a list. Now, even the term human capital is a little bit weird because you can't see, I can sell a machine. I can't sell my my skills. I can rent them as a labor market. I can't take them out of my body and hand them to you. Social capital wanted to say there's another set of things in a society that are important for productivity. And I think there's truth in that. One example is trust. So why would that be so important? Can I make a loan to somebody? Can I expect them to pay it back? Well, it depends. One type of social capital I have with my immediate family members. Of course, I could make loans to my children. I would never write anything down. I would never give it 2 seconds thought. It would happen. But it's more broad. In other words, we can't write down contracts, and the government and laws cannot control every contingency. And so societies in which we have people that trust each other, of course, which means they're being trustworthy, will be more productive. And so that would be one example of what's called social capital. Another example of social capital has been referred to as social networks. All right. So an example of a social network is if you had not gone to the University of Wisconsin and taken econometrics from me, we wouldn't be having this conversation because we wouldn't know each other.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And so, but the point was that something created a connection between us. And so, it maybe would have, I'm just saying that things would be completely different. If you look at how do people get jobs in a society, it is very common in the United States that you know somebody working there. They tell you about the opportunity. So social networks transmit information. They also matter because we have relationships between people. The fact that I know you also and like you, that matters for how I'm going to interact with you. And so another dimension of what's called social capital are the social networks between people. Now, when I say that I've been a critic of it, it's not that I don't think social networks are irrelevant to how organizations function, or that I think trust is not an important constituent of societies. I think they're very different things. And so this is the pedantic economist, is I want people to be very clear about mechanisms. Exactly. Yes. What is it that matters? So if somebody says to me that the government creates a national science foundation and gives research grants to young scientists so they can pursue things, I understand exactly what that means. Mm-hmm. If somebody says to me social capital matters, there's all these people mean very different things by it, and I don't think I don't find it clarifying as a concept.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So I study entrepreneurship and venture capital, and there are a lot of sort of books and anecdotes that I read, and one of the important thing that kind of everyone is really aware of is they call a social capital of an investor or network of an investor. So let's say you're a firm, you're raising money to your startup, and then there will be investor A and B. They're both bidding to invest in your idea. And a lot of the times, entrepreneur having the same sort of dollar terms of the offer, they will think, who does the investor know? So there they kind of explicitly price the social network, if you will, of the investor ahead.
Yes.
So if you're an outside rich person, if you're coming into the Silicon Valley, and if you're willing to invest, it's really uphill battle because a lot of entrepreneurs would not want to. I mean, the term they use is called smart money, meaning like the money, it's money and also like connections and
yes,
so
and
on. So that term, do you think in that sense the use of social capital as a term is it wrong, or do you think another sense?
I know you want to say wrong. I would say it's imprecise. And so I think what you said is what you brought up is extremely interesting, which is if somebody makes an investment in my organization, that creates a link to them. And that link can have consequences for the success of the organization outside the fact that I have their money and I'm going to use it.
Sure.
And so what would be possibilities for that? That the connections that the investor has would allow me to have communication directly with those connections. We talked about how ideas can be autocatalytic. Maybe that's a source in which ideas get generated. So I'm going to tell a story. You have to correct it because you know entrepreneurship and I don't. Because you could imagine that, suppose that I have a startup and the investor that gives me money also has made investments in other successful startups. By implication, they could have me communicate with the people who founded the successful startups. And there would be all of this knowledge about the success of the startup that can be communicated there. So that to me would be information transmission via networks. And so, as I said, this sounds like a little bit of being nitpicking, but just with respect to being doing social science, I think it's important to be very precise about the mechanisms.
I see. So, but also then, if we use the same sort of, let's use your word, pedantic approach, then even in human capital, we have to be really precise about like what exactly is going on. It could be like, skills, or it could be the ability, or like, let's say you train somebody to I don't know, communicate well, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. In fact, what is called the modern skills literature, which with the Nobel laureate James Heckman's been working on the last over 20 years. One way to think about it is that it's trying to move beyond this scalar notion of a skill called human capital to say there's a plethora of skills. The big substantive finding from that literature is that in addition to the conventional measures of what's called cognitive ability, is that there's personality traits that matter for economic success. And so one example is think about the service sector, service as industries. They have to do with personality. In other words, is somebody agreeable? Is somebody, capable of being extroverted and interacting with people? You brought up a different personality trait with this conscientiousness. And you could think about, its importance is going to depend on occupation. But so I'll put it this way. You and I as teachers, we really want conscientious students, because it's not just how smart they are or how much we've taught them. It's their willingness to work through problems that take a while, et cetera. And so I think that the skills literature, its substantive contribution to thinking about, questions of prosperity, is the recognition of the importance of personality traits. Now, let me add parenthetically that one of the dimensions of this, which is interesting there, is openness to new ideas.
That's a very important trait, I would say.
Yes, and so I'll put that in the skills literature. And so in the American case, there's been 5 personality factors that have been identified.
Big 5.
Yeah, the so-called Big 5. What that means is you ask people a large number of questions, many people, large number of questions, and you look at commonalities in their answers and see if they're interpretable.
How predictive those are with economic outcomes?
I would say that they are substantially valuable in adding to the predictions of the conventional measures. So to give one example, there was a Ph.D. student at Chicago whose thesis I was on. She's now at University College London, named Sarah Jaffe. And what she found was that to understand the gap between the wages of men and women, one of the reasons to understand why it had gone down in the United States was the change in the composition of the economy. As the service sector increased, the importance of good personality skills went up, and women on the measures of things like agreeableness are higher than men. I can give a different example, which is in some sense pretty obvious, which is in the American economy, the importance of physical strength has gone down.
That's what I was
about to ask. Yes, exactly. And so, the value of being just strong, being able to lift things, has changed because the nature of technology has changed. And so I think that that's why I use a very specific phrase that it augments conventional explanations, I think, in an interesting way.
Interesting. So if you are if you're running an organization, and let's say you're on the hiring side, how much weight you would put on that kind of tests and personality trait? Like, you could observe in a Spencean way, everybody went to the same university. Let's go New Uzbekistan University.
Yes.
And you're hiring somebody, and then you have to, what we call, discriminate. What I mean is like to choose the best out of those to perform whatever the tasks are. So how much weight would you put in, and do you think that's a wise idea if like an HR department would use it?
I think it is wise for an HR department, but I can't give any guidance because it depends on the task. In other words, if my goal was that my organization was going to prove the Riemann conjecture in mathematics, I'm not going to be worried about anybody's personality traits. I would look at one thing. If I have a sales force, I'd look at something else. And so I think this is very derivative from the context. Now, keep in mind, in bringing up these issues of personality, there's something one has to guard against, which is subjectivity. Mm-hmm. We know what a math test means. Okay, you could say there's limits to what it implies, but the point is that these are numbers. Asking about whether somebody's agreeable, those types of things, much trickier.
It depends on the context, and it depends on
Y-
the issue.
Yes, and so, one thing in any hiring organizations, you don't want irrelevancies to determine the hiring, or somebody hires their friend as well because they're very nice, they're very agreeable or something, and so one has to think carefully about that. But it doesn't mean it doesn't matter, and you can't ignore things just because they're hard to quantify. It just means that one has to be judicious in their application.
I remember once you were giving a lecture in New Economic School in Moscow, like 7 years ago. And there you have used this example of Palo Alto schools and sort of selection of children with different socioeconomic background. Let's say people with not a lot of resources, they would spend considerable resources the parents would spend considerable resources to put their children into better schooling, so that the outcomes would be better. And so now I'm trying to like think through this, and I'm thinking like, do you think that those like personality traits in some sense are like a random draw, or are they inherited through like?
I think that there's an important component of inheritance. I don't think it's genetic, so I want to distinguish that. And so the example here's an example. I guarantee all three of your children are going to go to college. Okay,
so it's a very high probability. Yes, I agree.
So when I say guarantee it, is they're going to grow up with parents. At least one's a professor. They both put profound value on education. And so think about who their friends are going to be when they're growing up. Many of them will be the children of college professors. And so and the serious point is just the same thing as for my children. They have some choice about going to college. Yeah, I wouldn't have forced them to, but they lived in a world where it was very much expected of them. So there was a huge value that was transmitted from parent to child. So in that sense, I think that one absolutely should not, minimize the importance of parents as carriers of values, of aspirations, of norms. An issue that's come up in the United States, and it's not a secret. The United States is a very troubled country right now. Things are going very, it's starting from a very high base, but by American standards, things are going poorly. I want to give you an example of one, which is that the belief of parents in the importance of their children going to college seems to have declined.
Wow. This is like perception and survey.
Yes. Wow. Now, the question is, why did that happen?
Why or when?
Why? What went on? And so part of it seems to be disillusionment of their parents with college. And so there's the story that would be told is a lot of people thought that college was going to, lead to much economic prosperity. They didn't do as well in life as they hoped. A lot of college debt, so they don't think, maybe exposed was a mistake. Now, the fact of the matter is the return to going to college is higher than ever. It's a catastrophic mistake not if you can go to college not to go. I'm bringing all this up because I think that if you're asking about enrollment patterns and things, this disillusionment is going to be a very serious impediment to the United States. And so that's what I meant that as an example where parents transmit things to children.
So the beliefs of parents shape the outcomes of the choices that children make.
Well, it'll shape their choices. The reason I was teasing you, I was saying that our kids are all the same because they grow up in a world in which it's inconceivable. You just got to do it.
Correct.
And so that means they're going to do it. With very high likelihood, they do it. If your parents say, well, it's up to you. If you want to do it, it's okay. I'm not going to pressure you. Then the likelihood it's going to happen is quite different.
A friend in Moscow, he studied mathematics, obviously, and he said, I said, did you have a choice? Because his parents were mathematics professors in Moscow State University. He said, of course I had a lot of choice. I could be a differential geometrist or study differential equations. Like the set of choices was different things across mathematics.
So let me give a very different example, which I think, if you'll forgive me, as an observation I've made, with my very limited opportunity to meet people in Uzbekistan. It has to do with optimism about the future. Okay. That's something that parents are going to help shape. In other words, do you think the world is going well or going poorly? I think that the transmission of optimism has large effects. That tells something about the aspirations that people have. Do you think that you can do better than your parents? Or do you think that it's unlikely you can do that? Do you think the world is going to reward effort more than it does now, or less than it does now. So all of those types of beliefs about the future, I think, have profound effect on children. And so the reason I brought it up is one of the observations I would make is I found people here are very optimistic about the future. It doesn't mean that they don't see challenges, et cetera, but there's an enthusiasm for what's happening, what's going to happen, and I'll even give you a statistic that reflects it.
That is very key point.
And as I said, I'm saying this as an outsider. I'm talking about a country of 35 million people. I'm, based on, talking to 30 people. But the point is, I think you could correct me if you think that's incorrect, not correct. But that's a perception I have. Again, the new Uzbekistan University, one of the delights of talking to the faculty here and the rectors here is their excitement about the future. They believe they're building something.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I think I read this book by or about Danny Kahneman, a psychologist who got a Nobel Prize in economics. And I think somebody asked him a question, like in an interview or something, like, "What would you want your kids to have?" I think his response was, "I want them to be optimistic."
Well, I think it's profoundly important.
And so every time I hear something like this, my question is like, then what is a mechanism that shapes the people's beliefs about their positions? Like, obviously, if you look at Uzbekistan and US, let's say your empirical observation is true, just for sake of discussion. Income-wise, America is much richer. Opportunity-wise, America has more opportunities. But as you said, in terms of like sort of anecdotally, like you see there's a lot more optimism here than you would sort of notice in many places in the US. Especially, I feel like, I'm not sure if it's true, but like I feel like it's kind of inversely correlated with education, I feel like sometimes. So like this pessimism about the future is not, how can I say, is not very much mediated by the level of education. In college campus, like some kids are really worried about, at TA, I talk to students, they're really worried about climate change, for example.
Yes.
Like for real, and then they think they can't do anything about it, and they feel hopeless, if you will. But here, like I don't notice that sentiment among same.
Okay, that's interesting.
Like, so what would your take be? Like, why there's a heterogeneity, if you will?
Well, some of the questions you're asking is about as I said, what's wrong in the United States. Why? And there's many explanations for that. Let me at least put one on the table that's relevant to public, specifically policies. And that's the term I used before was inclusive prosperity. And that is a perception in the United States by many people that they're going to do worse than their parents. The problem, that's the American myth, shall we say, the American dream. Part of it is your kids do better than you.
Okay.
And I think that the belief that that's going to happen is dramatically decreased. It dramatically decreased, by the way, because the truth of it went down. So there is a fact there. I think second, increasing inequality has caused, many people to feel that they've somehow been left out and to feel they've been wronged. A third issue, and which is a more delicate one to talk about, is that the pessimism differs by race and by education.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the most pessimistic people or the angriest people, they tend to be white and they tend to not have gone to college. That's a group of people who, in absolute terms, have done poorly economically. And the second thing to say is that this is the complex thing in any society is to how heterogeneous people can prosper together. And so what I mean by that is that take the United States, where in the last 60 years there has been dramatic improvements in the treatment of Black people and of women. Opportunities opened up.
Yes, inequality went down.
Yes, but by definition, if I improve the opportunities for those that didn't have them, in relative standing, somebody's got to go down. In absolute standing, everybody can go up. But we are creatures that care about relative status. And that has a lot of effect on people's psychology. And it was, again, it's a tautology that if you open opportunities for some groups, the group that was benefiting before from the injustices is going to have relative declines. I think that's part of the story.
That's a very profound point. Like I haven't thought from this end, because I thought, U.S. economy has been growing one of the best in the Western world, in the developed world, in terms of rates, even in the last 5 years or even in the last 50 years, whatever measure you use. And then in Europe, there's almost this, how can I say, saying that, somebody's optimistic, they're acting American, sort of like, being optimistic was sort of part of American.
Well, I very much think that's true.
That's true.
And I think that that's part of, I'll say the crisis in the country is the breaking down of this traditional optimism. And I think inequality plays a role in it. I think that racial and I think tensions about the status, about the equality, about the status of people of color and of women is playing a role in it. And so it's a fundamental thing for a government to think about. And that's why I keep using this phrase inclusion. In other words, what we know is that, income inequality substantially increased over the last 40 years. And there was also substantial, changes in occupational structure. Lots of types of jobs were eliminated because of globalization and because of technical change. Yeah. And so you have, lots of losers as well as winners in all of these, dramatic changes, dramatic by American standards changes, and losers are going to feel resentments. And so that's why the challenge in high growth is also to make sure that it's spread out appropriately.
So in other words, like nurses now get paid a lot more than they were being paid before. But if you're a coal miner, you don't want to work as a nurse because for some reasons you think that kind of a job is not appropriate or like doesn't align well with your status as a man or a person from. Is that something that what you're trying, like in a very simple sort of example?
Well, it's a thing to think about. Yeah, I think that's a good example. I will mention, by the way, that Paula England, who was I'm not sure she's still a dean. She's one of the world's leading experts on exactly this issue. Yeah. So you really should talk to her about it in the context of entrepreneurship. Forget by adding that. So there are issues of some occupations being perceived as masculine versus feminine. Yeah. But I think that you gave an example. The overall point is that kind of in these relative movements, the enhanced status of women, men have, there's issues of self-esteem, psychology, et cetera. Before the 2016 election, there was a very interesting article in the New York Times, which actually was interviewing people who used to be coal miners, who were going to vote for Trump, and the article, to be honest, it was the New York Times. It was kind of, how can you do such a thing? There's a little bit of undertone of that. And what I would say the article to me spoke to, and that's why I remember it, 8 years later, is desperation. These were people where things were going poorly. And so there was an example of a coal miner, ex-coal miner, who now worked at a shopping mall as a guard. And so he made much, much less in income. The second thing is he felt humiliated. In other words, coal mining, as you know, is a very hard job. Yeah. But he took pride in it because he thought this was the fuel for the American economy. And that's a very different thing if you're, telling kids not to smoke on a curb. And so I mention all of that because I think that, is what I call the American issue is and by the way, Marx had an idea called alienation. In other words, if you have increasing which matters seriously, and that is that increasing, large numbers of people who are not fulfilled from their jobs, either in terms of the income success or feeling like the meaning of work, that's a very dangerous thing and very unhealthy thing for society. One of the, in some ways, the silliest assumptions economists make is that people have disutility from labor. We don't, we have some disutility from doing certain things in labor, but there's a distinction between kind of the number of hours versus an occupation. In other words, our lives are, substantial parts of them are involved in what is it we do and the psychological benefits we get from that. And so I just put that as a deep challenge.
And so when like in economic models, labor is bad. So you want to
Yes.
do less of it if you can.
Yes.
Right. So and what you're saying is that, I mean, there might be parts of it which is bad, but then a lot of the meaning that the person has in their lives comes from the types of work that they perform.
Yes.
Like I do this podcast, I don't get paid or whatever.
Yeah.
I can
Absolutely. And so, sometimes you have these Silicon Valley fantasies that with robotics and artificial intelligence that basically people won't have to work anymore. That's not my idea of a utopia. That's a dystopia, because you're going to have people whose lives are not going to have the meaning that they come from doing. And again, it sounds very corny and simplistic to say it that way, but I think it's in a fundamental question. And for me, all this question about robotics and artificial intelligence, what's it going to do to work? I don't think it's going to eliminate jobs. Those pessimists, I think, are they're making assumptions that are not, there's no particularly good reason to believe. On the other hand, I do worry about the meaningful nature of work. So let me give an analogy about something I know nothing, I don't know personally, which is chess. Is the meaning that one and the pleasure, the sense of achievement that a grandmaster has, will be higher or lower if every grandmaster can couple with a program? You see what I mean? You could have competition, again, assuming that there's some residual value to what our brain can do versus a computer chess program. That could be, you could say there's the artificial intelligence, the resolution is that all the championships are going to be a combination. I don't know if it's as meaningful. Again, I'm not a good chess player, but I meant that it's just a thing to think about.
So, so the other challenge of thinking about inequality that I've witnessed, I want to tell you like a very short story that I've witnessed on things that you were saying. I took a trip on like 5 years ago. Oh my God, before COVID. There was some state park in not in Indiana, but in Iowa. So it's like there's a city called Dubuque, Iowa. It's like west of Madison, as you know. There's some state park on the shores of Mississippi, and we camped out there. And there's like a really small town. I went there for coffee. So I was sitting there. I wrote this post on my Facebook or somewhere. So it's like it's a town of desperation. If you will, it's like a quite white place. There's Walmart, there's Dunkin' Donuts, and then I took a local sort of a paper like of that town, and I was hearing these conversations about and there's a science about like opioid clinics and people like suffering with this, and the whole like half of the newspaper was about that. And guys next to me, like men, were talking about like trucking jobs and so on. And you can see that the town was like really like in a bad shape. There's no jobs. People are unemployed. There's like, how do you call it? Like a payday loan shops.
Yes.
Like you can see the sort of level of economic prosperity from like brick and mortar shops and whatever it includes. And Madison was like an hour and a half from that place. And the same day I went to Madison to State Street, and almost every shop, it was summer. Every shop had this like help wanted, it's like $20 per hour and whatnot. And if you go and work for that money, you can like survive in Madison. You get paid more than a B, for sure, right? If you work that way. And so I was like thinking, like, it's almost trivial that if somebody lives in that depressed town near Dubuque, it's a small town, I don't remember the name of it, and they drive an hour and a half, like take a bus or whatever. If they go and like, I don't know, work in State Street for a few months, they can pay the rent and, work for Starbucks, get some benefits and whatnot, go to college. Like, you can make your life easier if you're from there, and it's not happening. So in an economic model, like if some place pays higher, you would think people would just move there and then things would go out. And at that moment, I realized about.
Well, I think you made actually a very deep observation, because there's a general view, which I share, that the amount of internal migration in the United States is less than it quote unquote ought to be because of the large differences in economic conditions across locations. Now, I say lower than it ought to be. That sort of sounds strange, because after all, people are choosing not to move. So the real question is, why is it that people are very sticky with respect to where they live? And there, I think this is where you think about social capital. In other words, well, I would say one thing is that the act of moving. So yours is a long commute. So let me say, if the question is it's 4 hours away, so you're going to move, that's giving up a community. It's giving up proximity to your family members, to your friends, to the particular way of life of a small town. So I think that's one thing to think about. A second thing is I wouldn't know how aware people are in the town that there are these types of excess demands for labor in places like Madison. The third thing, which I don't know the answer to, is whether or not people from these small towns would feel uncomfortable in Madison. So you might say, well, how could that be true? Because I think that there is a lot of stigma from highly educated people towards people that are more modestly educated or are from rural places.
And so I see. So they want to find like sense of belonging, if you will. And
okay, again, I'm saying this for rhetorical effect, but if somebody comes from from a rural area and is working in Madison, and every day the people there tease him for being from a farm, that may not that could become painful, or people communicate contempt for the place he came from, like, oh God, what a horrible place you are. Isn't it great to be in Madison? Those are very difficult things to live with, and not having to have to live with. And it's easy for people to say, "Oh, it's not a big deal." Well, it's not a big deal if you never experience them. And so I think the issue again of belonging, of being treated with respect, very very important things. So and so one
levers to change that. Right?
Yes, and thinking about how to do that it's a hard thing to do. I felt one of the reasons in 2016 that Trump won in a surprise was that there was a great deal of contempt by highly educated people towards everybody else, and I think that to the point where this was, I think, part of the psychology of electing somebody who was overtly denigrating of the educated.
So thinking about inequality in America, you're a leading expert in inequality. As I understand, very kind of from very high up the literature, a lot of sort of explanations of inequality in a developed world, such as the U.S., was at different levels of human capital or social capital, right? And now we just spoke that, both human and social capital, in a sort of quotation marks, are downstream of other, I would say, how do you get other initial conditions.
Yes.
That you are like raised in, like households, towns, and whatnot. And so what policy levers exists to make sure that at least that people who are able to get this human capital will get it, and then the inequality in the left tail of it would like move to the right.
So I think one way to proceed is to ask about two levels of influences. Some are family level and others are more social. So with respect to family influences, there's very good evidence that intense early childhood programs have very powerful effects on a success in life. And so programs that provide this type of intense early childhood education to disadvantaged families are going to have, I believe, and again, Heckman has argued this, have very high rates of return.
Yeah.
So that's one example of a policy. The second class of policies, and this is really me in terms of what I think about, if we've said what is the most, if you said what's the biggest source of inequality in America, and it can only be one word, I would have said segregation.
In space?
In everything. Oh. In other words, that so many things that influence our lives some of them are socially determined. And when people have different social environments, by implication, their children have them, and that creates inequality. So what would be examples? When neighborhoods are segregated by income, rich children from richer families and poor families, they go to schools of different quality. The neighborhoods will have different levels of exposure to lead, which is a catastrophically bad thing for education. They will have different levels of violence. In the United States has Yes, and yes, it's on the violence. Americans own a lot of guns, and there's very high violence rates. And when children are exposed to violence, it has catastrophic effects again on their learning. And so, I would think neighborhood segregation has huge consequences for inequality. So that would be just one example of it. A different type of segregation is educational. Now, I'm not, and what do I mean by that? What I mean is that colleges segregate people by their achievements as of graduation from high school. And so one has to think hard about why have that segregation? Why have elite schools where it's really hard to get into versus others? Now, there's excellent reasons to do it. In other words, part of what a society does is not just address, equality, because they randomize who goes to every college. Yeah. Okay, I'm not talking about that. I'm saying, but you have to think about this issue of the consequences of differences in the quality of college educations. And my view there is there's much that societies can do to improve the less good American colleges, the less good colleges, to improve them. Similarly, I think the elite colleges should be much bigger. And, something I've said on a number of occasions, in fact, I said it at my institution, I said, the United States does not need another University of Chicago. It needs another University of California, Berkeley. So what I meant by that is Chicago has 7,000 undergraduates. Berkeley has 40,000. But it's a gigantic university, lots of but it produces lots of very talented students go there, and it's produced no end of Nobel laureates and very successful people. And really, what I'm trying to say is that educational systems, they want to promote excellence. You want to identify the most talented, the highest potential students, and really invest in them, because that becomes the technocratic elite that can lead the economy. On the other hand, you want to minimize the presence of bottlenecks. In other words, where it's just so hard to get through them, there's only a small number of people that can benefit. And so I think trying to widen these bottlenecks is extremely important. One way to do it is to explicitly increase the sizes of the most elite universities. Another thing to do is to think about the role of high schools in producing students that are strong enough to go to the elite colleges. Yeah. So we have presidential schools here. That's a mechanism that is doing that. Yeah. But that's something that, again, in the United States, one could see the potential for substantial increases in that. So when the Supreme Court of the United States banned affirmative action, an economist at Harvard, Roland Fryer, wrote a comment in the New York Times, which I thought was quite profound. I should say, he is not sympathetic to affirmative action. I'm in favor of it. I've written many papers on it. But he said something that was very powerful. He said Harvard and Yale should each build a high school for disadvantaged people, so that these kids who are going to bad high schools can go to a great high school and therefore look great when they apply to these fancy schools. It's a very serious point, which is that if you're worried about the segregation, the inequalities from the segregation at the higher level, you then need to think about the intake, as you said, who's the intake is, and that's why I put enormous value on primary and secondary education not being bottlenecks, having very broad opportunities. So that would be kind of a way I might think about it. Types of segregation are inevitable in societies. One type of segregation is who marries who. And so what the term of art is what's called educational assortative mating. Yeah. And that is highly educated people trying to marry highly educated people. We can't imagine a society where you'd want to interfere in that. That would be disgusting. On the other hand, trying to equalize the quality of schools for 5-year-olds, that sounds pretty laudable to me. Yeah. Trying to open up the bottlenecks so that the intake to elite schools is higher, that sounds very admirable to me.
Don't you think that for elite schools like UChicago or Harvard, the part of the deal is that it's a club good? So if they make more of it, the value of it on average goes down, and the reason they keep their enrollment so small is I'm sure UChicago can quadruple their enrollment without the decline in quality. I'm pretty sure that the amount of people of excellent quality who apply there is so long that that they can pull this off.
Well, this is part of what I think is true, and I'm putting no value on the club good.
Yes.
I mean, one silly way to think about it is, and I don't know the statistics on that, is look at these elite schools and ask, as the population of the United States went from 200 million to 340,
Oh,
did
it
they?
decreased. It decreased. I looked at it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, they should have gotten. Shouldn't they increase proportionately?
Yes.
You know, so
At least.
yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah. And so and that's the general principle I would put on the table.
But even more than that, like 60 years ago, most of the applicants to these schools were from the United States. But now I think the number of international applicants is, if not more.
Oh, it's yeah. That
Right?
one of the things
So
that
like
made
the
it hard.
world also grew.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
if Chicago's educating world, they should like 10,
Well,
10x.
listen, as an American, this is something I think is, obviously this is one of the things that makes the United States, which is having talented, gifted people coming here. And so I think it's fantastic that the market became international for American universities. But it also means that the universities don't have the size, as you said, the United States is 5% of the world population. If you're going to have everybody's is in the competition, you got to be a lot bigger.
So in the same fashion, I was thinking about inequality. So we just discussed that human capital is the main sort of explanatory reason why there's huge inequality in the developed world. But why human capital is the explanatory power, there is some papers, and I'm sure you're well aware of them, that the technological change and development of informational technology was a contributing factor.
It's a very good point, because so one thing is you have inequality in human capital. The second is, what are the consequences of the inequality?
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of skill-biased technical change, I think, has some truth in it. In other words, the marginal value to being relatively highly skilled increased because of things like the computer revolution, et cetera. So I think there's certainly truth in that. One thing I haven't mentioned, of course, is that some of the inequalities are simply derivative from the tax system. In other words, the United States has relatively less progressive taxes than Europe.
Yes.
And so, kind of in the explanations as to why the U.S. looks more unequal than Europe, there's many of them. But one of them is that Americans are very hostile to taxes in a unique way. And, for complicated reasons, the tax code is it's less progressive than other rich countries.
Yeah, I think your colleague Alberto Alessina has this paper in which the first quote is that every American is a temporarily embarrassed billionaire or something. Like he got it from some American writer. I'm not sure. I'm blanking on the name.
Yeah. Well, there was in 1972, the Democratic candidate for president basically proposed 100% inheritance tax above $1 million. So one way to kind of, to equalize things is you tax the inheritances. And so he proposed 100% tax. He quickly withdrew it because the public went berserk in hostility to it. But the famous story was that among the most hostile people were union members. They weren't millionaires, but they wanted their kids to be. And so this belief in upward mobility, very important. And it has implications for what people are willing to support in terms of redistribution. Another interesting statistic to look at across countries is the answer to the question, you think economic success is primarily due to luck, or is it due to hard work?
Yeah.
Get different answers for
Americans
different countries.
live more on hard work.
Yes. And this, yes. I think this is what if I call something an American myth, it doesn't mean it's false. It doesn't mean it's true. It means that it's an important thing to believe.
So, given the rise of AI and technological change, some of your co-authors or colleagues are really worried about it. They write papers and op-eds on New York Times every time there's a new op-ed on what AI would mean to labor markets and inequality. So what's your take on this?
I want to I don't want to say I want to pass, but I think there's so much uncertainty that it's very hard to say something which I want to tie high probability to. Mm-hmm. There are clearly big gyrations, and I think one of the typical answer that an optimist will give is there's always been technical change. After all, it used to be there was an industry to make saddles for horses and buggies and carriages, and they went away with automobiles, but then people became automobile workers. Okay, so there's truth to that. In other words, that whenever technologies change, new jobs are created. The thing that I think does need attention is that artificial intelligence isn't producing a new type of good. It's actually creates a replaceable skill. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to truck drivers that you mentioned. we are reasonably close, if I understand it correctly, to having self-driving cars.
You can already ride a self-driving taxi in San Francisco.
Yes,
I did.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so let's say in 10 years that we have self-driving trucks.
Okay.
That will be the end of a million jobs in the United States.
At least, yeah.
Yes, and so I think that a way to think about the gyrations are that these will be specific replacement of skills.
Mm-hmm.
To give a different example, yeah, I want to be mean. I can't imagine that financial planners of banks, people who advise people on investments, how will that career survive when artificial intelligence is going to allow me just to input my financial facts into a very powerful program that will, in ways no human being can do, assess the idiosyncrasies of my risks, et cetera. And so I think that that's going to be the qualitative change. And so I think that there will be very substantial gyrations of that form, which will cause certainly temporary inequalities. What I think becomes science fiction, is why I don't want to say anything much about it, is what new jobs are going to emerge in response.
So in terms of inequality, this is a technological change that, as you said, in the skills-based technological change, it may actually increase inequality because the payoffs for people who are trained to do that type of
yes,
work.
I think that very certain skills, the market value of them will disappear. It's a little bit like the value of strength disappearing.
Yeah.
But these will be what we call cognitive skills or coordination. I don't know, I don't have a good language for talking about the skill to drive a truck. I certainly could never do it to save my life, but I mean, with training, I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So there's a set of skills there, but those are going to be diminished. And so it's very hard to say what the future is going to look like for obvious reasons. That said, I think that it reinforces the importance of high quality education, so people have the capacity to develop new skills. Mm-hmm. And so, if you get I think the advice to any transitioning or developing economy such as this one is the absolute central importance of primary and secondary education. And the development, or you already have a lot of colleges, but everything you can do to enhance them in terms of the cognitive abilities of the population.
I see. Let's switch gears before we sort of end this. You have written your dissertation, Ph.D. dissertation on econometrics and macroeconomics. I think your advisor was
Peter Phillips, yes.
Peter Phillips from Yale, and so you are an econometrician, and you have seen, I think, the change in the way that economic papers and econometrics was used to answer questions. Sometimes it's called a causal revolution and so on. And I want to know your opinion on this, and in particular in the following statement, if you will. I feel like when I read an economics paper, I feel like a lot of the times it's written to defend the causal argument in a very like a defensive manner, like you thought there is this loophole, but we took care of it and so on. And there's a little bit in the literature, like looking under the lamp, sort of like we will write papers only on things that we can really causally establish really well. But if the question, no matter how important the question, if it's not bulletproof, like if you don't have like a bulletproof answer, a lot of people, even in our kind of world, say don't attempt on working on this because it's so hard to defend. So what do you think on this defensive writing in terms of methods?
Well,
am I right though? You can say like I'm
no.
totally
I think there's much truth in that. I think that the development of the so-called credibility revolution and causal modeling, led to many, many valuable advances in social science. I mean, Felix Elwert is a very eminent sociologist at Wisconsin, is one of the world's leading experts on causal inference, was lecturing at the summer school. And so it's not just economics, it's throughout statistics, sociology. And so the extent to which you enhance the credibility, the believability of results, what was the effect of policy A on the distribution of educational outcomes, that's all fantastic. What you alluded to was something else, which is the development of a set of methods that are extremely good at answering certain questions could have the side effect of creating what I think is a false belief that there's only one way to answer questions.
Yes.
So an example that I often give in teaching is, if I wanted to ask the question, what were the causes of World War I? There's not ever going to be a causal inference that gives it to me. In other words, I can't construct counterfactuals meaningfully from data and talk about the average treatment effect of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that isn't the only way I would learn about things. The point is, one would understand the history in a deep way, the history, the politics, the economies of the time, and of course we have very strong answers to explain these things. And so I think what got lost is the recognition that empirical work in social science should never be theological. There's not a truth as to how you're supposed to do it. The only thing you're supposed to do is get it right.
Yeah.
And there's a whole set of tools, and you choose the tools according to the question. Yeah. And that is, I think, where you found the defensiveness and some tendency for narrow questions, which have causal inference answers to receive lots and lots of attention, where some shine away from bigger questions where the answers are going to be more imperfect.
Especially as a junior person, and it takes a lot of time to publish for people who don't know this.
Yeah.
Like the advice a person gives, advisors and so forth, they tell you to focus on things that you can identify really well, even though at the cost, if you will, of the more important questions, because in the publication process, this may hinder your chances. And I'm asking you, I guess, because I've seen that you have incorporated a lot of ideas from sociology into your own work. And this is uncommon, to put it mildly. Economists don't even cite sociologists, let alone use it. So can you tell me more about your kind of craft as a researcher, when you incorporate ideas from different fields and disciplines?
Well, maybe the way I would start is by saying is that my interests have been in phenomena as opposed to disciplinary questions. That sounds very pompous, but what I mean by that, let's take inequality. If I want to understand decisions by which, some births the parents aren't married, non-marital fertility, just has inequality consequences. Or a health issue, cigarette smoking. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm not judging people who smoke. I'm just saying as a factual matter, it has health consequences. If one wants to explain, why some people make these choices and others, it's very difficult to think them through without knowing the literatures that talk about their social determinants. In other words, the world I grew up in, non-marital fertility was highly stigmatized. It's less stigmatized today. So on and so on. Those are social questions. And so part of the answers, I think I was interested in questions where social science collectively had made many advances in areas outside of economics. The second is that I think that one of the, because as a methodological statement, there's an old saying that economists are great at answering questions, but not so good at formulating them. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that I think that the formalism of economics has led to, enormous intellectual advances. Mm. But we always have to be in mind in asking, how do we enrich the formalism to have more realistic visions of human behavior? Behavioral economics as a discipline or as a field of economics, I think, can be understood as an effort to improve the psychological realism of modeling. My efforts, for what they're worth, were trying to focus on social realism. And because my beliefs from living as well as from studying social areas outside of economics was the importance of things such as role models, such as social norms, such as the way that information flows between friends versus others, etc. And so for me, it was a very natural thing to do. I guess the other thing to say, we've got my own intellectual history for better or worse, is that I've always been very interested in probability theory. And the reason I bring that up is that
teach too in econometrics, by the way.
Yeah. And a lot of the work that I did in trying to integrate sociology and economics was derivative from learning new probability theory. And it was probability theory of how populations of interacting objects collectively behave. And so once I sort of learned certain models, then I could see analogies to, something about a social phenomena where there's a resemblance. And of course, that's the, one piece of hard work is to learn the probability theory, because probability theory is hard. The second piece of hard work is to adapt the structures in probability theory to conform to appropriate social science. So what do I mean by that? A lot of the probability theory that I work with originated in physics, because it was describing the interactions of atoms. Well, atoms don't think. And so if I'm going to use that probability theory in social science, I have to reformulate the objects. I have to say these are objects that are making decisions based on beliefs about things, about preferences, et cetera. And so what turned out, fortuitously or happily, and, I think in my own work was one could make that leap. In other words, I could preserve the choice-based logic of economics, yet incorporate some techniques from statistical mechanics. It was the branch of probability theory I was working on, and that would then allow me to build in the sociology and then talk about the same environment with the sociology, but then keep the precision.
Is there a sociology of Stephen Durlauf in the following sense? Because the economics department in Wisconsin is in the same building with sociology, and we have excellent sociologists. The school was very, very famous. Especially in the questions of inequality. Like my thinking was like, maybe you were influenced being around them.
So the truth, I started to do this when I was at Stanford. So in that sense, it predated Wisconsin. On the other hand, Wisconsin does have a great sociology department, and there were people I was, interacted with regularly. I think the important thing there was that there was some positive reinforcement of where I was.
I see.
And it mattered in two senses. One of them was simply they understood things in a substantive way that I didn't. And second, the fact they were receptive to what I was doing mattered too. In other words, I found it very annoying in my career when physicists say they're going to do economics, and
the reason for such a horrible thing.
Well, it's because the economics isn't good. They may have, know fantastic amounts of mathematics, but they weren't good models. And so to me, it was very important that sociologists, I could tell what I'm doing. They say that made sense to them as a sociologist, as opposed to an economist masquerading as a sociologist. So I think that having had very impressive sociologists interact with those things mattered in terms of a community.
The place we are in right now is New Uzbekistan University. It's a very new university, and you came here to give a talk at the summer school and teach students. And before that, we met in Moscow, and again in summer school. And I know that you have been going around the world, actually, teaching students around the world about econometric methods, inequality, and everything in between. What motivates you to do so? Not a lot of professors do that. And what's your thinking on that?
Well, I think it's at several levels. One of them is there's all this untapped talent in the world, and I am conceited enough to want to do it. In other words, take the New Economics School. Right now, I'm the director of the Stone Center for Research in Wealth Inequality and Mobility in Chicago. I met the two postdocs at the New Economics School.
I see.
And so there were these just very talented people, and this was an opportunity to interact, identify the talent, bring them over. The same thing I'm sure is true here. In other words, this is another place where you have incredible intellectual potential, because this is where things are beginning to develop. Okay, so that to me is issue number one. The second, again, is that I believe in what I do as a social scientist, the type of models I work on, the kind of ways to think about identification, and I want to propagate them. I want to tell people you should do this and make a good case for it. And the third is that, there's obviously, things are also personal. Think about what a fantastic life I have. I get to fly from Chicago, Illinois to Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and spend time beginning to learn about another civilization, about another culture, and expand all of my horizons, think differently.
Yeah, and the students here in New Uzbekistan University, and so this is the new school, and a lot of students across the country want to apply here. And I'm sure a lot of high school students would watch this. And I'm pretty sure about this because this is kind of the university now for the country. And they want to, let's say they want to become an economists. I want to ask you this question that I asked you a very long time ago in Wisconsin. So I went to your office hours once and I said, I really want to understand econometrics. What should I do? What else should I do? You told me you should understand sigma algebras and measure theory. You should go to a math department and listen to that. And I did, and it worked.
Okay.
So it was excellent advice to study mathematics. And So what would you advise students? New Mexico University has an excellent mathematics department, as I heard.
Yeah.
Obviously excellent economics department that they're establishing as well. But what would you tell an aspiring economist what they have to focus on to become a researcher and professor? Like you did to me, like 8 years ago.
Well, I think that's your achievements are your talent. I don't think, so that I'm embarrassed to suggest a conversation matter. This is what I would say. I think that if one wants to be an academic economist, the language of economics is mathematics to a large extent. It differs across areas. Economic history does not have mathematics the way that microeconomic theory has. And whatever niche you find in economics, you want to be a complete master of all of the tools conditional on the niche. Yeah. And so if you think about it that way, when you start off, you want to be building tools that let you achieve that at the end. So that's the backwards induction idea. And so having a rigorous undergraduate knowledge of kind of the usual suspects, understanding calculus, understanding linear algebra, and understanding something that's, sometimes it's called real analysis, sometimes it's called topology. There's lots of jargon for that. Those will simply give you the background mathematical language so that when you see the formal models, you understand what they're doing. Yeah. Okay. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of, vast mathematical knowledge in terms of becoming an economist. On the other hand, having, one of the younger you are, the easier it is to learn things like math. It's the same thing I say to students in graduate school. In terms of your elective, take tools courses, because this is the time you can build the tools and then you use them. And so I would certainly urge undergraduates who are thinking of academic careers to take a good portfolio of mathematics classes. Going back to the issue of learning econometrics, strong knowledge of probability theory and strong knowledge of statistics. I don't want to say it'll quite make econometrics special cases, but there's a sense in which that's true. In other words, econometrics is going to be a study of certain phenomena that are predicated on some more abstract principles. So I think that that's absolutely the case. Also, given the strength of the university in mathematics, of course, you want to take advantage of that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's really just a matter of building up a background that lets you get to the quote unquote more substantive social science.
Thank you. So, Stephen, last question before we finish is that I know you have written a lot and did a lot of research on capital punishment and literature generally crime and punishment. And here in this country, there was some terrible crimes that happened, and there were calls, like we don't have capital punishment like the US does. And there was calls to adopt an American method, if you will.
Yeah.
So what would you say on that? Like, do you think it was successful in deterring crime or not?
So there's, I think, two justifications for capital punishment. One of them is the so-called deterrence phenomena. The argument is that if you have a death penalty, murder rates will be lower, or heinous crimes that have subject to capital punishment will be lower. That is an area that I've written a number of papers, and they've been focused on trying to understand why the literature had different answers, and is there an answer that accounts for the heterogeneity. And the conclusion of that work was there is no evidence in the United States that capital punishment deters. However, there's also no evidence it doesn't deter. And so
whatever I say is going to be true.
Well, and this is a very serious point, is the data the history of capital punishment in the last 50 years does not allow one to answer the deterrence question. And the reason for that is that, the U.S. has, let's say, 12,000 homicides a year. And if it has 30 executions a year, it's so infrequent compared to the number of homicides. The idea you could find that evidence was probably silly, but let me leave that. The serious point is that the proper statistics tools show it's not resolved by statistics. Now, you said a separate thing, which was these were heinous crimes. Mm-hmm. The idea of capital punishment for heinous crimes is not about deterrence. It is about retribution. Yeah. In other words, there's a separate issue that society's time to ask about, which is, are some crimes so horrible that the quote unquote ultimate penalty is appropriate? Mm-hmm. That's not, an economist can't answer it. That's a philosophical question.
Yeah, it's a moral philosophy.
Yes. And so, if you'll forgive me bringing up, an example is the executions of Nazi war criminals.
Yeah.
I don't think there was any serious argument that this would deter future genocides. That wasn't why it was done. It was done because the human race.
The revenge, right?
Well, I want to distinguish retribution and revenge. Revenge has a kind of a negative term connotation. Retribution has a positive connotation, a neutral connotation. If I say that some things are so horrible the human race can't live with them, and somehow it has to do this to say it's unacceptable, then that's a little bit different than saying I want to hurt you because of the terrible thing you did. But it's not. I have no more standing to have an opinion on retribution and revenge than anybody else. I have opinions about it, but I think that you want to, in thinking about whether to implement capital punishment, you want to distinguish those two justifications. Now, among the objections to capital punishment, you have to consider one of them. Those are kind of distinct. One of them is to argue that it's a priori immoral for governments to execute people. Yes. A different argument would be that the fear of executing somebody who's innocent, that injustice is so terrible that it dominates the other factors. And the third is a more pragmatic one, and this is the American system. I mentioned that the number of executions is very, very small in the United States. And that is because the legal system is designed to have many appeals and reconsiderations of capital sentences. And so it's a very costly process to go through trials, retrials, reconsiderations, appeals, before there's an execution. And so it typically takes many, many years between the sentence and the implementation, not in every place, but in most places. And that's a lot of resources. And so to me, a legitimate question is whether or not you want to not do that and use the resources differently. In the criminology literature more broadly, in the American case, there's much stronger evidence that the certainty of punishment is a better deterrent than the severity of punishment.
It's Gary Becker's argument, right?
Well, no, he had a trade-off. He did, but I think he missed something, which is he had expected payoff calculations. Yeah. And it turned out that what he said was the opposite. He said that you shouldn't spend that much on policing, but you should really punish people if you catch them.
Oh,
it turned out empirically the opposite's true, which is the more cost-effective strategies focus less on the severity of the sentence and more on the certainty of punishment.
This was Stephen Durlauf. Thank you.
Well, thank you
for your time, and we're really pleased to have you here in Uzbekistan and in this podcast. Thank you.
Oh, no, the honor was mine. Thank you so much. Rahmat.
Thanks, Stephen.
I'm Fatima. I'm Zuhra. We are students of New Uzbekistan University. We're majoring in software engineering. So why did I choose software engineering? Well, first of all, software engineering is very rapidly growing major, and it's become very crucial to know how to deal with even basic digital technologies. Furthermore, I think it's amazing to know that you are the one creating the comfort and the opportunity for people around you. Like if you want to invent something, then you have the skills and the knowledge to do it. That's what I find fascinating about software engineering.
When doing the research and thinking about where to study, I first focused on a university that would give credits to students' academic performances. And I was really happy to find out that this university gives enough credits as an accomplishment to my studies. Another compelling advantage of this university is, of course, its community and professors who really are into your life and into your academic performances and are there for you to help you and to strive together with the community.